You know I wasn't going to let you guys get out of here without some sort of presentation about vintage radios and boat anchors, and that's kind of the reason why I got this thing started a bunch of years ago. And I felt like there's probably a bunch of embryonic boat anchor restorators down here someplace, and we got to get them incentivized to do this. These are just a sampling of some of the rigs I've rebuilt. And of course, there's that Cosmophone, one of the few that are still out there. So, you know, the problem with the world today is everybody's just too damn stressed out. You know, people don't have hobbies anymore and relax. And, you know, and it's just because there's no downtime with work. So ham radio is an excellent hobby, of course, but take time to enjoy it and spend time with it. And don't just be all worried about answering that telephone whenever it rings.
Put up a beverage antenna.
You can do that. Or you can put up a flag. Or you, or you can put up that 100-foot tower with the rotating loops. You can do all of that. And that will make you feel really good. But George Carlin had lots of ideas about doing that. Throw out the non-essential numbers, especially, you know, age, weight, height. Doctors worry about all that stuff. You don't need to clutter your brain with that. You know, keep only cheerful friends. You guys are great. I mean, you know, that's all you need. That's why hams are good, you know. Keep learning. That's really the important thing. Keep your mind busy, especially as we get older. It's important to keep thinking, you know. And amateur radios is fabulous for that because it's so many hobbies rolled up into one. It's not just DXing. It's not just rag chewing. It's not just working nets. It's not just boat anchors. It's not just playing antennas. It's all kinds of things, and that's what makes it fun. You can get tired of one aspect and move on to something else. And because of that, I found that newfound affliction of boat anchors just a few years ago in a more involved state than I was in the past. Before, I was just interested in central electronics because my mentor was Wes Shum, and I learned so much from him. But I've expanded that dramatically, kind of like building antennas, I guess. You can't just have one, you know.
Since you worked on that
Right, yep. You know, and there are many more people getting interested in restoring these old rigs, and there's a reason for that. Why? Because most of us baby boomers dreamed and drooled about these radios when we were young. You know, I remember back in the back of the radio club with David Sapp over there, we'd look at the old QSTs and see all these wonderful ads and these great radios and say, man, God, it'd be wonderful if you could have one of those, you know. Instead, you go back to your little Arc 5 receiver with the novice band about that big, you know. And that's what a lot of people are doing today. They're reliving their childhood, I guess. You know, collecting the radios that they really wanted before and trying to get them on the air. Some, you know, and it's a great hobby to do that. It's kind of like folks with the automobile hobby, you know, because everybody wanted hot rods when they were young. They couldn't afford them. Well, now as they're older, they're doing it. So, but, you know, and that was the golden age of ham radio. And Bob and I were talking about that just a few days ago, how the 40s, 50s, and 60s were really the true golden age. But it came with a lot of grief, too, because we got blamed for everything, you know. TV being bad, the washing machine not working, the ovens broke, smoke coming out of the house. It's all because of a ham operator down the street. So if you want to get interested in collecting, first thing you need to do is figure out what radios you want to restore and what your goals are. Some people want to just buy radios that look nice, put them on a shelf, and collect them in that way. You know, others want to operate them. Some want to restore them to factory fresh condition, or even more hot rod them for another thrill, to make them perform much better than they did when they originally were made. Some like to go to the military equipment, which is a whole different sphere altogether. But before you do any of this stuff, you need to walk before you run. Ted brought it up before. It's important to study, you know, to learn about this stuff in advance. What's the best way to learn about it? Well, look at past QSTs and CQs. The ones in the 50s and 60s are really filled with a wealth of information. It was fun to read. You know, you hear about all this noise about, you know, ham radios, a dying hobby, and we don't have enough hams and all that nonsense. It's funny, you read the CQ magazines in the 1950s, and they're lamenting about the same thing. Back then, they only had 160,000 amateurs. Now we're close to knocking on 800,000. So it is a growing hobby. It's still a fun one. To do the boat anchor bit, you really need to start building up a library of resources, parts catalogs. The GE Ham News and the RCA Ham Tips are really good little publications that were made back in the 50s and early 60s. They were distributed by electronic parts resellers. You know, you could go down to your Southern Radio, whatever your radio emporium was, and get a copy of these things when they were published on a quarterly basis. And there was tons of information about new parts, new tubes, new ideas, construction articles. They were really fabulous. And you need that kind of information. Instruction books for the rigs that really interest you. You can't fix them if you don't know how they work to begin with. You know, and the period handbook, since you're dealing with a lot of vacuum tube stuff when you're dealing with boat anchors, you need to go back into that era and get the textbooks and the handbooks, theory magazines that were talking about vacuum tube equipment. Because, you know, if you're into the solid state stuff, it's a whole different world. And now, of course, we've got the internet and Google. We didn't have that years ago, but man, that's like putting you in a big giant library. And if you can think about it and put it in a Google search term and hit the button, you'll be surprised at what you'll find. Might even find out where a TR8 schematic is. You never know. Yeah, you know. Many beginners really are overwhelmed at trying to even think about rebuilding a radio, taking a radio like that and making it work again, you know. So my feeling about that, and some people do this, is to look at Heath Kits first, you know, restore Heath Kit. Why would you want to do that? Well, first off, it's got an instruction book that tells you how to build the thing. So if you have a book that explains how to build it, and its theory of operation, and how to test it, and how to get it working, well, you got it made. You know, you have a roadmap to follow. You know, and those instruction books are really written by artists because the illustrations on them are perfect. Some people today are rekitting Heath Kits. And the reason is, well, you know, they're not making them anymore. The last ones that were made were in 1992. Lots of people enjoyed building them. I know most of us have built at least one, or maybe tens, dozens, hundreds of Heath Kits. They're just fun to do. And folks are rekitting them. How do you rekit a Heath Kit? Well, you buy a Heath Kit at the Ham Fest, and you take it apart and clean it, change components, and rebuild it again. Build it just like you were building it from scratch. That's how you rekit. And you learn so many good things about how to build, how to solder, how to assemble electronic equipment that you don't know today because you're buying it already built in a box. The only thing you do is plug it in the wall. Big deal. That's not fun. Besides, you know, it's about that smoke thing again. You know. Don't plug it in when you bring it home, no. Don't do that yet. You know, the Heath Kit I think most people should start with, if you're going to use a Heath Kit as a model to get into the boat, eventually get into boat anchors, is to buy a kit that is actually going to provide something useful at the end. The little Heath Kit monitor scopes, there was a HO10, which is the one that was built in the 50s, and then when the Heath Kit SB series came out, the SB 100s, 101s, all of that's 401s, 301s, all that stuff. The SB 610 was a really versatile scope. It's got a two-tone signal generator in it. It can monitor actually your receive signal, but principally it's used as a transmitter monitor. So you can look at it and see how bad your signal stinks before somebody just screams at you about, yo, you're flat top and you're broad as a barn, your signal just sucks, you know. So it's a useful thing even today. So that's something you might want to, and the parts, you can buy all the parts. You can buy everything from DigiKey or Mauser. There's plenty of them to pick from. I mean, look at all these Heath kits. This is one guy's collection, and it doesn't even scratch the surface. All those little green boxes in there and all Heath kits. So, you know, you're not going to get bored rebuilding them. Now, test equipment. You can't really do any troubleshooting without test gear. And there's some items that you really need to have. You don't need to have them all at once, but you need to start collecting them if you're going to get interested in doing this boat anchor bit. Vacuum tube voltmeter is important because it can measure high voltages. You can put an RF probe on it, so it's an RF detector. Digital multimeters are good. They're not so good when you're trying to tune a tuned circuit to resonance, though, because the digits keep rolling. And with an analog meter, it's nice and easy to find a peak. Variax, you've heard a lot about them today, how important they are. They're important when you're first firing a radio up, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. Eventually, you'll probably want to get a tube tester, and we have some notes about the types of tube testers you should get. An oscilloscope, you know, when I was going in college, electrical engineering, I thought, you know, what do you really need the scope for? You need it for everything. You can use it to measure current. You can use it to, of course, measure voltages. You can do frequencies for response testing. A scope is the most useful tool that you could use and have in your workbench. Signal generators, they have all different types. When you go to the Hamfest, you see a plethora of those things. The military surplus ones are really quite good. The little, what is it, URM 25s? That's a really nice, neat little signal generator, and they're very inexpensive. You can get them for 50 bucks. Temperature-controlled soldering station. You need one of those because you can damage components if you don't have the right heat and you have an underpowered iron that doesn't heat the joint up quickly enough to get the components apart. So it's important to have a good quality iron. Don't use a Weller solder gun. You know, that's not what you want to do. Solder wick. Solder wicks looks like the shield on coaxial cable, but it has rosin in it, and it's used to lift the solder off of circuit boards or tie strips or switches when you're trying to take parts, take wires off of components. It's a very important tool. And of course, the regular old common hand tools you can pick up at even Harbor Freight. You know, as occasionally you would use them, but I like Craftsman myself or the higher brand stuff. Somebody talked a little bit about this before. I think it was Ronnie. You know, it's very important in amplifiers because you're dealing with thousands of volts. But these radios operate with high voltage, anywhere from a couple of hundred volts to a couple of kilovolts in some cases. And if you screw up, you probably may only have one shot. The next thing you might see is a cloud passing by and you strumming on the harp, and looking down, you can see your XYL disposing all of your ham gear in the garbage can, you know. So you don't want to do that. You know, the guys in the 50s, you know, when we were in our ham radio classes, the old timers always told us, keep one hand in your pocket. You know, and that's important because what you don't want to do is have one hand in the radio on the high voltage and the other hand on a piece of grounded equipment or on a table that's a metal table that happens to be grounded, because the path then is across your heart, and that's the end of your heart, and you finish with, and you know, you don't want to be there.
You let the smoke out.
Yeah, out of yourself, not out of tubes. Yeah, so that's an important thing whenever you're doing the smoke test, yeah. You need good tools to do good work. You know, and don't try to skimp on things. Mandatory tools are that Variax. An isolation transformer is extremely important because some of the radios, if you're into antique broadcast radios. Many of those don't have a transformer. They just plug into the wall, you know, and they rectify the house current to operate the tubes. And the filament string, the tubes filaments are designed so when they all add up, they add up to line current. So, you know, you don't have a transformer, don't need one. That's why there's that little Bakelite panel in the back of that radio, you know, and you want to avoid the ones that don't have one because that's a safety feature. So you can't stick your hand in there, hit the chassis. If you got a 50-50 shot of not dying one of those. If it's plugged in correctly, then the chassis won't be hot. But those old radios don't have a polarized plug. So you can easily have it reversed, plug it in, the chassis is hot, you touch it, and then you get shocked. Don't do that. Replace all the rusty hardware on these sets. I mean, oh God, you see some of these radios at the flea market, and they look like they were used for, they really were used for boat anchors. You know, hardware's rusty, they just look disreputable. You know, when you're doing a restoration, you have to change all of that stuff because it's a reflection. The way that radio looks or that device looks, accessory looks, is a reflection on how well you did your job. Oh, and I did make a note about your eyes being the best test equipment. You know, when you get a piece of this old stuff, really look at it closely. You know, examine the components. If you see a resistor that is, you know, twice its normal size, that's not normally a good thing. So you'll have to replace them. Same thing with capacitors. If you see stuff oozing out of the bottom of an electrolytic, that's not good either. But really, on all these old radios, it's a common practice. You should just change the electrolytic condensers because they have a working life. And when they fail, they can fail catastrophically and take out a power transformer, which is very expensive to replace. So how do you get going on this stuff, you know, when you got your new prize? Well, first thing, you disassemble as much as possible, but take pictures as you go. Because if you think your memory is going to serve you well, you're really wrong, especially because we're as old as the radios we're working on, you know, and they're not looking too good, and our brains aren't as sharp as they once were. So take pictures as you go. It's very... You'll be surprised how often you refer to them when you start building this thing back up, maybe a month or two later. You know, wash and clean. I use simple green and water to clean chassis. I've also used some other detergents. Lacquer thinner and alcohol seems to work good on wiring harnesses in particular. Polish and paint. Now, Duplicolor makes these paint in these cans, and it has a nozzle on it that's almost as good as a regular spray gun. So if you were having to make small touch-ups on small items, using that type of stuff, you can find a color that matches, that's great. If not, you can always go to an auto paint shop and have the paint color matched. Or in some cases, like Heath Kits, people are already packaging up spray cans that have the right color paint. You know, the greens for the cabinet, and for the front panel. Even the older radios that have a different color green, that stuff's packaged as well. If you're in the Carlin's S lines, you can buy Carlin's trim paint, you know, for the escutcheon that goes around this radio. These are often very well scratched up. You can actually refinish them to make them look like new. Replace anything that looks like it's blown up and bad, you know, resistors in particular. Coupling capacitors, occasionally you'll find some of those that are bad. They're ceramic ones, they generally are pretty reliable. You have to be careful of the old mica ones though, because some of those can actually migrate from one plate to the other and have intermittence. Electrolytics, if your radio's old, you probably want to replace them. Oh, and the other thing is, many of the ham radio devices, you can buy complete sets of capacitors from different vendors, like K5EF is one that can make a capacitor kit up of not only the electrolytic, the can, but also the small axial lead caps too. So you don't have to go looking all over the different suppliers to try to track those down. transformers and chokes, you should really check them to make sure that none of the windings are open or shorted to the core. That's not good. And then you want to repaint the transformer case so it looks pretty when it's back in the cabinet. The switches, I use deoxit on those, but you have to use it sparingly. Don't just flood the whole switch with deoxit. All you need to do is just put a little bitty drop on each of the contacts, clean them with a cotton swab, and that works out well. Don't just spray the whole switch wafer with deoxit or any of these other cleaners. I use a Teflon lubricant on the mechanical assemblies. I find that works very well. It keeps the parts moving quite freely, which is important. If you've got a band switch or a switch that is really difficult to turn, don't force it. Try to determine what the problem is, because if that breaks, it's going to be extremely difficult for you to find a replacement for it. These old radios generally only had a 2-conductor cord. Many of them didn't even have a fuse, especially the Johnsons. For some reason, they didn't particularly like to put fuses, except on that polarized plug of theirs. But it's a 2-wire plug. It's not a grounded setup. So put in a 3-wire line cord, so you always know you have a good ground. And also replace the bypass capacitors. They normally have 2 of those across the line. They tend to go bad with time. And finally, when you've done all of that, then you're in the point of being able to troubleshoot and test the set. You really need to have a Variax and one of these isolation transformers, because if you have one that's metered, a Variax that's metered, so it shows you applied voltage and current. If you have your radio connected to it and you slowly increase the voltage, if you see that current meter suddenly trying to go off to the peg, stop, because that will prevent you from, one, blowing something up, and also needlessly blowing a fuse. That's the time we have to go in and troubleshoot and find out what component is shorted in your set. And that's what one of these metered Variax looks like. You can find them sometimes, or you can build one of these real easily. All you need is a box. You buy the Variax, which is an auto transformer. It normally comes with the knob, so you don't have to hustle that. And then you just need to find a voltmeter and a current meter, and there you go. You can build this really easy yourself, because there's very few components to it. Now, of all the restoration tools I've got in my workshop, this is absolutely the most used device I have. It even beats the oscilloscope, because most of the work that you do on restoring equipment is cosmetic, making it look good again, And lots of this radio stuff that we get is rusty, or it has paint on it that needs to be taken off so you can repaint it. So I always use a Bead Blaster. And I use glass beads, not the emery stuff, because that's too abrasive. But with the glass beads, it wipes the paint off completely. You're not killing yourself sanding this stuff forever. And within minutes, you have a panel or a part that's actually ready to be painted.
Just don't try to take the engraved panels, front panels.
Yeah, right.
Just put it down in there, chip it out, don't
Right.
blast it out, because you
Right.
can blast away the engraving.
Yes, that's an important part. Yeah, you can, if you have like an R390, there's an engraved panel and the panel's all messed up, you can lightly bead blast it, but in that case, it'd probably be safer to use a chemical stripper, because what you don't want to do is take metal away from the areas where it's engraved, because then when you try to fill it in, the paint kind of spreads and it doesn't look as good. Now this you need in order to polish all the Bakelite knobs. All the escutcheons. It's first thing I do is clean all the Bakelite parts with a mixture of ammonia and Mr. Clean, and then I use the buffer with some polishing rouge, and it just makes these things look like mirrors. It'll also take out small scratches and stuff, so you don't have to hunt to find new knobs. The first question everybody asks me is, God, where do you get tubes to rebuild a radio? There are more tubes out there today. It's almost like they make, it's like they just come up out of the ground. I don't know where they've been hiding all these years. I've been to this one fella's place, and this is the one guy that I buy all my tubes from, is ESRC, which is down in Orlando. Orlando seems to be the home of new old stock tubes. He's got his business, but there's like 3 other ones. And his own place has got close to 10 million tubes, you know, and it's an enormous warehouse. And there's several other ones just like that. I don't know why they're all in Orlando, but that's where they are.
That's kind of like where they are at Europe.
Yeah. So getting new tubes is not a big deal. At the Hamfest tomorrow, there's going to be a dealer there that has tubes also. And at most Hamfests, you'll find there's at least 1 or 2 guys out there that are selling tubes. So tubes are not a problem. In fact, really, tubes are probably, they're not as failure prone as a lot of people think. I bought plenty of these old boat anchor radios and tested tubes and found most of them work. It's really capacitors that are the most offensive part in these sets and doing restorations. But you do need to be aware of what Gassi tubes look like. If you've got a tube that's got a getter on the top that now looks like that white cauliflower look, it is no good. Just pull it out, throw it in the garbage can, and plug in another one. Or if you got a Gassi 3500 where you apply plate voltage to it and there's a blue intense glow at the base, your wallet's going to have a dollarectomy done to it in order to replace it. Yeah. Yep. Now, a good tube tester is one, not the type, the cheap ones that just measure emission. I mean, if the tube is glowing 99.99% of the time, it's emitting. The one you want is the one that will measure transconductance, which is a function of gain. So that's the type of tube testers you want. The Hickok ones, which are the ones on the top, are the ones that are really sought after, but there are also kits. Heath Kit actually made a pretty good transconductance tube tester that was quite popular. That's the one down at the bottom. Military TV2, this is the Cadillac of them, but the TV7 is the more readily found at Hamfests, and I see them all the time whenever I would go to Dayton. It seemed like you just walk down an aisle and there's one tube tester after another, and they're just there. This is the one you skip, though. The drugstore tube tester, which is designed only to do one thing, and that's to sell tubes. Yep. My good friend Ted built an amplifier hive. It's good for one thing, though. See this meter up here? My friend extracted that meter, built a pair of 572Bs, operated that thing, and it's kind of interesting scaling on it, you know, where it says bad, question mark, and good. You just tune the good and you're okay, right? That?
Good to go.
Yeah, but, you know, just to give some ideas about the types of rigs you can restore. These are Central Electronics radios, of which I've restored hundreds of these, I guess. The 100V, the 200V. This is an example of what one of those looks like when it's done. You find them in all kinds of condition, though, today. But they can be made to look just like that if you're willing to spend the time. You know, all of these radios in my shack, they're all restored. None of them are new. They were all old sets I rebuilt. But you don't just have to deal with radios. I like mechanical stuff. And so I said, you know, it might be fun to, you know, when I was in high school, along with Ted and all, we were on the radio Teletype and scrounged up Model 15 and Model 19 teleprinters, and we actually had them on the air. But there's a number of guys now that are into mechanical teletype. They collect them, they restore them, they're actually getting them on the air. The last really contest that was held, or a roundup, I guess is what they call it, a number of them got on with their own mechanical machines. So I said, well, hell, I can't let these guys get ahead of me. So I got my two 15s restored, and that's a Model 19. And I took them all apart, rebuilt them, learned how they work. That's another thing. I mean, it's kind of hard to find out how one of these suckers works unless you can network with somebody. But it's fun. It's just, And, you know, so people say, well, what the hell do you do with one of these things? I mean, you get on the air, you don't hear any real teletype, the type that you would need to operate one of these sets. But they're on the internet. There's a group that does what they call ITI, Internet Teletype. So on the internet, you can actually get the audio tones for 170 cycle shift, run it through a regular teletype converter to drive the selector magnets on these machines, and they copy text. And what they do is they put news stories, and this thing runs 24 hours a day. It's kind of neat. So if you want to make a lot of noise in your shack too, you can get some of these babies. Now, you know, we're talking about little Heath Kits and small radios, but then we have the real boat anchors. You know, this is probably the most challenging one I've ever built. It's a TMC, Technical Material Corporation. It runs a pair of 400s. That's the final up on the top. The power supply's in the bottom. There's my trusty friend in the back, Larry, helping get this 350-pound power supply back inside the cabinet.
Notice the 2x4s.
Notice them, yes. What you don't see is a hydraulic lift table that was able to help us do this. So you buy some really unique tools when you're into boat anchors. I mean, everybody needs a hydraulic lift table, right? Yeah. That's the single sideband generator, which is neat because it does independent sideband. It does AM, CW. It's really cool. You know, it's a neat set. It weighs 875 pounds. There were two of these in the presidential train car. I found that out on the internet. I had no idea where they were used, except I did find that they were used at embassies for communication purposes. The FBI used to use those for radio links from FBI headquarters locations throughout the United States. And they were used elsewhere. But anyway, this one managed to find its way home. We took it all apart completely and pulled it back together.
We used those on the Coast Guard Lorraine station.
Did you? Oh.
That and the SWR dual meter.
Yes, yep.
I've got that and the antenna tubes that went with that, but I couldn't sneak that home.
I don't think so. They would have noticed the tires blown out on your trailer.
We used the GPR 90s.
See, this is what's good about boat anchor collectors. You know, a friend of mine up in Virginia spotted this thing. He calls me up, says, man, I got this GPT 750, and the guy doesn't want a whole ton of money for it. I said, well, that's great. Can you bring it down? And there was silence on the phone. I said, yeah, I guess I can. And a week later, he drives up in a van, and there it is. You know, so all it cost me was dinner for transporting it. There you go. All right. I'll keep my eye out for you. Don't be afraid to get started. That's what stops most people from wanting to do this crazy hobby, sub-hobby is, you know, I don't know what to do, how to get started in this stuff. Well, there's people out here that actually will help you, like my neighbor. Right? Yeah.
It's going to take a very short time.
Well, you know, maybe you got time for beer. Avoid the basket case radios. Don't buy one that looks like it was drugged behind a semi or actually used as a bone anchor, because they're too hard to rebuild. You'll be spending decades getting it right. You know, make sure you get acquainted with the radio history first, because it's actually quite interesting. It's neat to figure out, well, why did they design it this way? Or this company that built these obscure radios that you're interested in, well, you know, what's their history? Who started it? Yeah, and why did it fail, or why did it go away? That's all I think kind of neat. That's all part of the story. Sadly, you do really need to get friendly with your computer, though, because you need to talk to other people that have done this stuff before. You need to network to find components. And certainly you'll be spending a lot of time on there just learning more about your new treasure. Again, take plenty of photographs. You know, it's so easy to take pictures today. Don't be short-sighted with the photographs. Think about what you're doing. when you're powering one of these babies up for the first time, make sure you're thinking about safety first. If it blows up, that's no big deal. You can fix it. If you're blown up, well, it's not going to fix you. So put your restored radio on the air. You know, it's kind of like rebuilding a sports car. You know, it's one thing to rebuild it and put it in the garage, but it's a whole lot more fun when you're driving around town. So put your restored rig on the air. Let people hear it because it's part of the amateur radio history. And that's a big thing, I think, in preserving the hobby. You know, network with experienced rebuilders, guys that have done this stuff before. We're really interested in getting more people into this because it's so damn much fun. You know, it's really a blast. I've got this man addicted to the point if he has, you know, he's got to probably put another addition on his workshop for the more of these Drake radios he keeps bringing home. Yeah. Well, he started with one, then he added, and now he put a third edition. Pretty soon the lawn stuff's going to be out in the street. And a 10 boat anchor friendly hamfest. There are a number of these things around the country that really go into boneyards. If it's got a big boneyard, it's got boat anchors. So be on the lookout for hamfests that have boat anchors. The Belton Hamfest is a great one. In Texas, it has tons of boat anchors there. Over in Georgia, the Lawrenceville Hamfest, the Shelby Hamvention. I haven't been to Dayton since they moved, but I hope that it's as good as it was. And this one that you're going to see tomorrow, it's all filled up, all the tables are filled, and we're hoping to see a bunch of boat anchors there. So, with that, any questions?
Nick, I might say something
Yes.
about parts.
Yes.
I don't know, if you guys have, I meant to get into this.
Oh, yeah.
Tomorrow. How many people know about the Pine Board Project? We've got over 1,000 people. Many of them had to call me and ask me what kind of soldering iron do I need.
Yeah, right.
Oh, we have a 12-year-old girl, we have a 90-year-old retired priest, and everything in between building this. And it became the cover story for a January QST. I was very honored by that. But we built it each week on Ham Nation. We built a little by little. I would do this. George would then come the next show and explain the piece that we built. It's an amazing series. And if you really want to see the whole thing, just go to HioSound.com, go down at the bottom, and there's probably 50 or 60 pages, all the little videos. It's amazing. But this is the 75 and 40 meter version, and the preamplifier. The one we actually built has equalization in it.
But of course.
Yeah, why I bring this up, I put this out on Ham Nation. You know, we have 50,000 people watching this thing.
Yep.
And I got all kinds of doom and gloom. You can't get parts, you're stupid, somebody's going to get electrocuted. Well, it didn't happen. Antique Electric Supply in Mesa.
Right.
Those guys have everything. In fact, they got with me and they have a parts list. They have a pine board transmitter, pine board equalizer preamp, and the pine board power supply. But they have everything. And in our guitar world, my God, you can restore a Fender amp, a Marshall amp. They have all the parts.
Yep.
And so you really want to look at AES.
You will never have a bigger thrill than when you fire up one of your restored creations, or if you've homebrewed something like this and get it to work and know that you're the one that did it. You're the one that built it. You understand now how it works. You learn the theory about how it works. And people will comment, oh, God, that sounds great. I mean, that audio sounds wonderful. You're keying to. I actually like to hear every now and then a guy on CW has got a little chirpy signal because it lets you know, yeah, there's somebody out there really homebrewing again. This is great. You know, because back in the day, all these little crystal control rigs and the stuff that the novices use, they all chirp like canaries. I mean, you could tell one guy from the other just the way his radio chirped. But to have people that are building new kits, like I noticed there's a fella that's recreated the Amico transmitter. It's open the chassis with the tube in the top and the plug-in coils. You can buy the whole kit and build it. And it's silk screened. It looks just like the original. You can get on the air just like a novice did and think about, well, how the hell did I actually operate with this? You know?
And he bought the patent and the rights. We did one of them on Ham Nation, a couple. And of course, I took it one step further. I had a lot of the viewers say, "What about a Greenlee punch? What is that?" So I took a Greenlee punch, put a socket in the back, put my modulator on it, and I put the AC one on AM. Didn't I, George?
Yeah.
How do you handle your panels, Nick?
What do you mean?
You know, if you could, like I got my actual novice rig that I'm
Right.
going to try to get this thing back on the air again, and the front panel's a little messed up on it. Do you repaint those things? And
Oh, sure.
so what do you do for putting the labeling back on?
The silk screen? Well, if it's like, when I do the 100 Vs, 200 Vs, the Central Electronics stuff, 'cause I do so many of them, I had actual screens made. So you paint them and then you silk screen it, just like they did originally. What you can do with those, the first thing is you try to find one that's got an intact panel. Because if you're only going to do one, it's not economical to build a screen for it. But they still have, you can occasionally find those little rub-on label kits that were designed for hams that have the labeling for the different controls and all that stuff that are most commonly used. And sometimes that would work. Yes?
I don't know how far they've gone with this, but for the AT1, Heathkit,
Right.
transmitter, you can actually get a whole new front panel with the silk front.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Yeah, I think you got some people out there that sell panels doing different kind of.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
QSC
Right.
advertises
What was
on
that?
the rank, on QTA truck, there's somebody who advertises he does front panels.
Yeah. Yeah, for like the old Heath Kits back in the 50s, the green box ones, they have guys that are making reproduction front panels for them. For the SB line, you can buy new amplifier panels for the 200 and the SB 220. You can get all of those. There is a way you can. There's new products out that make like a plastic. It's kind of like a satin finish type of plastic material that's very thin that you can use a computer to develop the artwork for, and folks will make that for it. In fact, there's another firm that can actually make front panels. If you're home brewing equipment, they have the software. You design the panel with the lettering on it, send it back to them, and a couple of weeks later you've got a panel.
Nick, there's something else about paint.
Yes.
I just found this out recently. How many of you guys been through Hobby Lobby?
Mm-hmm.
Wife goes there.
Yeah.
They have 1,000 types of paint. They're not just blue and green, everything in between. It's amazing, isn't it?
Yeah.
And it's all good stuff, so if you need paint, I bet you can match some of the stuff.
And the thing about painting, though, when you paint with the spray cans, or even if you're using the paint, the sprayer and all the compressor and all that stuff, it's important to make sure that panel gets hot. To have it at 150 degrees to make it bake finished on. It's much more resilient to scratching if you do that. What I did was I went to,
After you paint it, you put it,
right,
heat it up.
yeah, you put it in the oven. Now, if you stick it in your wife's oven, you're going to really have a lot of problems. So what I did was I went to I think it was Goodwill or one of those places and bought a used stove. Electric stove. Don't get a gas one. Use an electric stove. You can unplug the burners from the top. I just put a piece of masonite on top to make like a workbench on it. Because all I was interested in was the oven. Just have to make sure it has a good working oven element and a thermostat that's halfway decent. And then you're good.
It's a toaster oven if it's big enough for the project, small enough.
Yeah, right. You can do wrinkle finish. I know a lot of people say, God, how am I going to fix the wrinkle finish? Well, that's actually pretty easy nowadays. There's this company called VHT makes three colors of wrinkle paint. Red, which you wouldn't use unless you were rebuilding a Ferrari. Black, which is really nice on especially the very old vintage stuff because that was all done in black. But they make a gray that's really good too. And there's a trick to making that stuff work. The first thing is you have to clean that item completely. By cleaning, I mean bead blasting it. To take all the old finish off, you can, I usually use an etching primer that you paint on it first after and kind of block sand that down after it's dried. Then I'll put it in the oven to get it warm, right? And then you take the spray can. Now here's the key. You shake the can up a lot and you spray left to right, right to left, you know. And when you get to the end, you let your finger up. So you don't want to ever have a double application of paint when your motion is stopped. So you go, you know, let it back and forth. But then you have to go on a diagonal both ways. That gets rid of the striping that you would normally see when you paint. Then as soon as you've done that, you put it in the oven. You come back in 30 minutes and you'll have the most beautiful wrinkle finish you would ever imagine. Looks as good as the factory.
And if you don't want those colors, when you're done, come back with the color you want and just put a light
Yeah,
coat on
a
top.
very light coat. You use the gray because the gray then becomes like a primer. So then you can take the color that you want it to be finished in and slightly spray it, and voila, you've got a rebuilt cabinet. Yeah.
Okay.
All right, thank you guys.